Can Taxes and Bonds Finance Government Spending? By Stephanie Bell. Section 6. Summary and Conclusions. If the government, Fed and Treasury, had no regard for the reserve effect of its operations, it would have little use for tax and loan accounts. It could simply create its own spendable deposit on its consolidated balance sheet and then spend, adding reserves and creating money without regard for the size timing of its tax receipts. But this behavior would frequently leave a banking system which was previously satisfied with its reserve position with substantially more excess reserves than it wished to maintain. A system flush with excess reserves would find few bidders for these funds, and the overnight lending rate would fall toward zero. Taxes, as they drifted in, would drain a portion of the excess reserves. Still, the funds rate could remain at a 0% bid for a prolonged period of time. In order to move to a positive funds rate, either the Federal Reserve or the Treasury would be forced to sell bonds to drain excess reserves. Footnote 18. Note that bonds would have to be sold even if the government ran an annually balanced budget. This is because it is impossible to eliminate the reserve effects of the Treasury's daily operations. Thus, swings in the Treasury's daily closing balance, which threaten to move the funds rate away from its target, would induce the sale of bonds despite an annually balanced budget. Banks not wishing to hold an excessive amount of non-interest-bearing government money would be all too happy to exchange non-interest-earning reserves for interest-bearing Treasury bonds. The bonds would have to be sold until enough excess reserves had been drained to yield a positive target funds rate. Although this process of adding and later draining reserves could work, it would involve substantial variation in the level of reserves and, subsequently, significant turmoil in the market for federal funds. Knowing that these are the undesirable effects of disregarding the reserve effects of its operations, the Treasury chooses to coordinate its operations, transferring funds from tax and loan accounts, draining reserves, as it spends from its account at the Fed. Taxes are not necessary for, or even capable of, financing government spending when they are paid using high-powered money, that is, by cash or check in a fiat money system. In order for the government to get its hands on the proceeds from taxation, it must place these funds into the Treasury's account at the Fed. As it does, the banking system loses an equivalent amount of desired and/or required reserves, either immediately or as the Treasury transfers the proceeds from tax and loan accounts into its accounts at reserve banks. And an equivalent amount of high-powered money is destroyed. Similarly, reserves are drained and high-powered money is destroyed when the Treasury issues bonds, immediately if tax and loan credit is not allowed, or with a lag as the proceeds are transferred from tax and loan accounts. In contrast, government spending from the Treasury accounts at the Fed injects reserves and creates an equivalent amount of new money, M1, M2, etc., and high-powered money. It is impossible to perfectly balance, in timing and amount, the government's receipts with its expenditures. The best the Treasury and the Fed can do is to compare estimates of anticipated changes in the Treasury's account at the Fed and to transfer approximately the correct amount to, from, tax and loan accounts. Errors due to excessive or insufficient tax and loan calls are the norm. Although same-day calls and direct investments are designed to permit the authorities to react to these errors, they are not always an option. When the Treasury is unable to correct these errors on its own, the Federal Reserve may have to offset changes in the Treasury's closing balance. This will be necessary whenever the errors are large enough to move the funds rate away from its target rate. In fact, as argued previously, the Treasury's balance at the Fed is often the biggest source of uncertainty faced by monetary policymakers. Its role as an offsetting agency is essentially forced upon it by its commitment to a target funds rate. Indeed, Poole, 1975, goes further, stating that the Fed will usually abandon any other objective target in order to maintain the funds rate within its tolerance range. The adding draining of reserves, then, is largely non-discretionary, as monetary policy is concerned primarily with maintaining the overnight lending rate. Fiscal policy, in contrast, has to do with determining the supply of high-powered money. Moreover, while both taxation and bond sales drain reserves from the banking system, neither provide the government with money with which to finance its spending. Indeed, both taxation and bond sales lead ultimately to the destruction of high-powered money. An analysis of reserve accounting reveals that all government spending is financed by the direct creation of high-powered money. Bond sales and taxation are merely alternative means by which to drain reserves, destroy high-powered money. The choice, then, is between alternative methods for draining reserves in order to prevent the overnight lending rate from falling to zero. In light of these findings, it is perhaps time to reconsider our definitions of monetary and fiscal policy, as well as our treatment of taxation and bond sales as financing operations.